Do you still need this one?
No.
Oh, I can do that. Kia ora, I'm Jenny Whatman.
And I'm Rosemary Hipkins.
And we're both from the New Zealand Council for Educational Research. So welcome to the Youth Guarantee webinar. We should apologise perhaps for choosing April the 1st as the day to present the webinar, but it's probably more important that it's the day before Easter, so you'll be wanting to think about things like chocolate probably. Oh, sorry, just bringing up the next slide. So we've conducted two workshops, one in Wellington and one in Christchurch, and we thought we could talk to you a little bit about the things that came out at those meetings. We had Cheryl White from the Tertiary Education Commission here with us at those workshops, and she did answer some questions about policy. Although our brief was very much to focus on the teaching and learning aspects of Youth Guarantee and literacy and numeracy. The questions that arose were about what people perceive to be the restrictions of Youth Guarantee in terms of demographics, a feeling that the 16 and 17 year age group was a bit tight, and the actual eligibility criteria were tight, so that meant that in most organisations they hadn't met their target numbers.
But some of them thought they might, in the 6 months coming up, they were going to start new programs in the second semester.
That's right. They did think that possibly a year was a long time for a young person to commit themselves and to find the money to do that, and maybe the policy could be for 6 months.
Yes, Cheryl made it plain that the policy is something that they're reviewing and making more decisions about it. She certainly was very open to hearing feedback from people.
Okay, so the other things that the workshops were interested in, and they were quite different in Wellington and Christchurch, was to talk some more about the research findings, and that included some more information that Rose had about the literacy and numeracy standards for the National Qualifications Framework, sharing resources, which will be difficult for us to do in the webinar, but we can talk to you about the things that people brought with them and some of the online resources that people talked about. And then the literacy and numeracy assessment tool. Unfortunately, we won't be able to do a demonstration of that in the webinar, but we've got some screenshots to talk you through some of the kind of teaching and learning implications of that. So, we started our morning by looking at some statements that had been raised by the research that NZQA did last year on youth engagement in literacy, language and numeracy. And I'm hoping that you've had an opportunity to at least flick through the handouts that were posted on the webinar site. Yeah, so there was a 1-page summary and a 25-page summary, and also some information about the unit standard review. But if you haven't had an opportunity to read them, it won't matter. We suggest you go back and get them off the site and reinforce some of our conversations by having a look at them. Okay. So Rose.
Well, now I'm just going to take a few minutes to reflect on some of the things that came out when we did this interactive continuum exercise in Christchurch and in Wellington. if you look at those statements there, and I think that now we've just got Monica, so I'm not sure why Jean's left the meeting, but anyway, Monica, if you have a look at those, you might like to just take a minute to think about whether you agree or disagree with those things that are there. And then I'll just, if there's any of them that you're particularly interested in me discussing, if you could type which ones they are, I'll see that on the little screen at the right. If you can do that, maybe you could just type me a couple of X's so that I can see that you're actually able to do that. No. Okay. Well,
oh yes, Jean's
Jean's
back
come
again.
back. Hello, Jean. Thank you for coming back. I'm just about to talk about these continua, which I hope you can see on the screen in front of you. And you might like to take a minute to think about whether you agree or disagree with them and how strongly. The thing that was interesting when we did this in Wellington and in Christchurch, we actually got people to stand up and sort themselves along a continuum, and we picked them one at a time, obviously, and we didn't have time to deal with them all in each workshop because they generated so much discussion. We dealt with the first two, the first one and the third one, the one about young people being different, and the NZQA were the two that the Wellington workshop participants chose to talk about, and then the bottom two were the two that the Christchurch participants chose to talk about. We thought it was interesting that neither group chose being literate in the 21st century, since that's actually what the initiative and the workshop's about. But what we did find was that for the statement that there was most agreement about was the bottom one: new understandings of learning mean it's no longer appropriate to teach in the way that we were taught. But there were still some people who disagreed with that. And what we found was the way that people responded depended very much on how they were thinking about what that statement meant. So if they were thinking about 20th century things, then they tended to think, no, it's not different now. I mean, that seems a bit self-evident when you say it. But for instance, for the first one, if people thought about the needs of young people and their basic learning needs, then they disagreed with it. But if they actually put the emphasis of the statement on the 21st century, then they did agree, because they thought, yes, there are some things that are different now. And what came out was not that it's an either or, because the things that applied in the 20th century obviously still do apply, but that there are more things and different things on top. So it was a sort of a both and conversation, really. And that applied for all of them. So, for instance, if we take the bottom one, good teaching has always been good teaching, but there are some new understandings now that add new dimensions on top of what we always considered to be good teaching.
And it was interesting how many people felt that the way they were taught had worked very well for them.
Yes,
and
that's right.
That they acknowledged that they were using some of those methods which appeared to be working well for their learners.
That's correct, yes. So that's probably enough to say about that, but at some stage we may have an opportunity to write that up, but not at the moment. Yeah.
Yes.
And to move on, Jenny.
So those were some of the areas that we touched on in the background literature review that we did for the research. But we might look now at more specific things. What I'd like you to do is just to look at each of these statements in turn, and if you've had a chance to read the material on the site, you will have seen that these were all things that were foregrounded in the research. I'm wondering what you think about that statement that young adults should be taught separately from older adults. what the research found and what the people in our workshops found, that is, there's probably no one right answer.
So it's another both and.
It's another
or
both
two
and.
and both, yeah.
Many people felt that the youth guarantee young people were easier to manage, if you like, when they were in classes with a whole range of adults. And in some organisations they were mixed up with other learners, and in other organisations they were in classes that were discretely youth guarantee. The research that we read was very clear in terms of Māori and Pacifica that young adults shouldn't be separated, so that the whānau approach was absolutely the way to manage teaching and learning there. The second point, whether or not young adults are more extrinsically motivated than older adults. This was very clear in the research, although not necessarily clear in terms of our participants in the workshops, that young people are extrinsically motivated. They were motivated by things that were as straightforward as chocolate fish or being allowed to smoke at morning tea time, but most motivated by having short-term goals which led to achievable ends, so a certificate, a unit standard, a qualification, and also by organisational treats such as playing sport or going on a visit or having those kinds of, if you like, changes to the more traditional pen and paper teaching and learning. So that came through very clearly both in the literature that we used and in the New Zealand case studies and interviews. Yes, young adults will be motivated by rewards. The third point, again, a very strong yes. Work placement, work opportunity, and work prospects are very important in terms of engaging young people in literacy and numeracy. So that whole contextualisation and embedding of literacy within a work context is very motivating, and young people are much more likely to be engaged in that instance. I might let Rose talk about the next one, although we've touched on it in the previous slide.
Yeah.
Do you want to, if I put you on the hop?
No, that's all right, Jenny. I think certainly the research would say that that's true, because a lot more is understood now about how the brain actually makes connections, how it stores things, how it retrieves information for reasoning, that has quite strong implications for the way that teaching and learning take place. Broadly, I suppose, if you were going to use a theoretical term, you could say that learning research is lumped under a heading called constructivism. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody now that learning is seen to be something that you actively have to do for yourself, and no one else can do it for you. But the other thing that's interesting too is that people are very much questioning this view of the mind or the brain as being something that sort of sits inside the body but is untouched and separate from it in some way. The philosopher Bruno Latour calls it the brain in a vat approach, and that kind of sums it up very well, because we know that actually a lot of the learning that we do through our fingers, we do through the tools and resources that we have available to help us. And so those views of learning now take a much more holistic look at the whole learning context, not just what's happening in the mind. That's probably enough detail, Jen.
Thanks. tertiary education should replicate the best things about school was a deliberately provocative statement. What was very, very clear in both in the literature and in the New Zealand interviews that we did was that young people had very negative experiences of and memories of school and were engaging them in literacy and numeracy post-school had to be unlike school, so not like school. However, having said that, and the conversations we had at the workshops reiterated that good teaching and learning is the absolute crux in terms of engagement.
No surprises there.
No surprises.
Yeah.
Again, a slightly controversial statement. I think what we found is teaching is a very holistic job. These young people in that sort of 16 plus age range need deliberate pastoral care, and the people at our workshops were very strong about that, perhaps slightly surprised in terms of the other people who were in their organisations, how much support and one-on-one they needed. So again, all part of the relationship building and respect, hand in hand with good teaching. I know that literacy and numeracy embedding needs to be explicit, particularly in terms of reporting on outcomes, but what we found in the research is that there's a whole range of ways to approach literacy and numeracy by embedding, and we didn't find any one right way. And certainly talking to people in the workshops, it's what works. You may start by pretending literacy and numeracy is less important than vocational learning, or you may start the other way. Start with the vocabulary or the numeracy that needs to be taught as part of the vocational. There's no right way, but embedding is definitely an approach that works nationally and internationally. So, moving on. Just a wee bit about the research itself. I'm not sure if I said this will be on the Department of Labour's website very soon, and when we follow up with the forums on the Literacy and Numeracy for Adults website, should be able to give you the link to that research. What we did found was that there was not a lot of research internationally that directly links young people's literacy and language and numeracy outcomes with effective programs, and that's partly because the research hasn't been done, partly because it's often been done in very short time frames where it's very difficult to measure improvements in literacy and numeracy.
You really need a good tool to do that, don't you?
Is that an advertisement?
Advertisement, yeah. We're coming to that.
Most of the research we read was evaluations of projects, particularly in the UK, and they often had very, very small sample sizes of about 5 to 6 people. So we found we had to do a lot of knitting and weaving of pieces of research and information to come up with our findings. We didn't find anything that directly or any definitive thing. We found lots of pieces, but often they contradicted each other about the economic impact on the individual and society of having improved literacy and numeracy. That's young people I'm talking about, except for some piece by Tyler in the United States, which suggested that investing in numeracy in this instance and literacy for people with very low literacy and numeracy had a marked effect on their prosperity in later life.
No surprises there.
Yeah. Having said that, the much bigger project that the Department of Labour's been doing about literacy and numeracy in adults in New Zealand has got some very strong conclusions about the benefits of investing in literacy and numeracy. And that research hasn't yet been published, but it does have some quite exciting findings. We're actually talking to ourselves now, I think.
Yes, I think we are.
I think
Yeah.
Jean's going in and she might be having connection problems.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we just keep
Yeah.
on?
Yeah.
Okay. The other difficulty in measuring the impact of literacy and numeracy is that many programs are funded for people to either go into further tertiary employment, education, or into employment. And when they move into employment, which is often the best outcome, they leave the research. So you end up with a sample size that's not useful in terms of showing what happens. Something you'll all be aware of is the measuring of soft outcomes. A lot of the research has reported on perceptions of learners and perceptions of educators. So huge improvement in self-confidence and self-esteem alongside the growing improvement in literacy and numeracy. Jill, soft, yes it is. Yes. And that's why I put it in italics, because personally I'm not sure I actually like that term.
Well, there's a bit of a pejorative attached to the soft in there,
as opposed to hard.
An implication that the hard ones are more important, And we don't think that we agree with that, but those are widely used terms in the research literature, aren't they? Well, here I am speaking for you, Jenny.
No, they are. They're very widely used. Yeah. And there was quite a sense, both internationally and in New Zealand, that governments are not rewarding, is the wrong word, but are not acknowledging that when organisations improve learners' self-confidence and self-esteem, they're actually adding to the economic prosperity of the country.
Actually, perhaps just before we move on, an interesting observation there is that there's quite a lot more emphasis on so-called soft outcomes in the school curriculum now than there used to be with the introduction of key competencies into the curriculum. And when those were first designed, they were intended to go right across early childhood school and the tertiary sector. The tertiary sector's been quite quiet about that just recently. You can read about them in the school curriculum itself. The New Zealand curriculum, which is online on the TKI website, has got descriptions of them. And in fact, there is a dedicated website on a Key Competencies website. What's its URL? It's
keycompetencies.tki.org.nz.
keycompetencies.tki.org.nz. Lots and lots.
Welcome again, Jean. You seem to be having trouble maybe with
hearing
your connection. We're not sure. So if there's any way we can help at all, but it's great to have you there. We should move on, I think. So just finishing up on what the research showed us, a very wide range of perspectives about whether young people are different or not. And we've tried in the research to couch that in very positive terms. So young people are different, but not better or worse. And in terms of engagement and motivation, we've covered some of these in the other, in the previous slides. One of the things we really puzzled about is how do we get young people involved in further education and training or employment. What we found in our work was that most people are referred by an organisation such as SIPS in New Zealand or by word of mouth. So in the overseas literature talked a lot about how difficult it actually was to engage the young people who most need to be there. That advertising, pamphlet drops, those kinds of things just didn't work. So I think it's definitely something for the government to think about, that whole group of young people who have left school and sort of disappeared from the education scene. I've talked about the impact of the school experience. One thing that seemed to be very different for young people that we talked to in their tertiary and post-school experience from school was they felt they were treated as an adult and as an individual. Came across very strongly, and that they had a voice. So in terms of engagement, those things are crucial. We've said it 3 or 4 times and we'll say it again, there's no substitute for good teaching. The people we talked to, many of them I felt were the sort of unsung heroes, if you like, of the education sector. I think we talked quite a bit, or a little bit in the research about making comparisons with the early childhood sector 20 years ago or so, so that people who have got the most important and most difficult jobs in education are often the ones that are least well paid and sometimes least well qualified. And appreciated. And whose status in education terms is lowest. The people we talked to appreciated the government drive to offer opportunities for upskilling, especially doing NCAL and other qualifications, and that did seem to have had quite an impact on the organisations and on the educators. So I think probably all those things we've talked about, just to reiterate the point that engaging young people is not just about happening at the educator-learner interface or the program interface. It has to be working across the organisation as at a much wider level, as well as at that one-on-one level. Student voice. Jill, definitely. And I think in the 300 odd pieces of research that we actually used to write our literature review, as well as in our interviews with people in New Zealand, that young person's voice was totally missing.
Perhaps if I just jump in and make a comment there, going back to the continuum statements at the start about young people being different in the 21st century. There's quite a body of literature that talks about the fact that young people now are accustomed to making decisions about all sorts of things and are striving to be and wanting to be active in their lives in a way that perhaps wasn't quite so important for us. We were more prepared to accept what was decided and determined on our behalf than today's young people are, because of the freedom and autonomy that the technologies that they use has afforded them. For instance, their communication technologies and their ways of being in the world are very different from what, well, certainly people of my age experienced growing up. And so, yes, it would be easy to say that this is just a trendy thing, but actually there is something important going on that makes this an important issue to deal with. Also, if we take one of those other statements about the importance of being active in your learning, if nobody is listening to where you're at and what the impact of your learning is on you, then how does a teacher make decisions about the best way to make links to what you need now? So there are several different ways that we could actually look at that whole student voice issue. Again, in the school curriculum as well, there's a growing body of research around that. Yes, engaging strategies is part of the key. The teacher thinking differently about their role is another part of it, I think, and how they actually appropriately share decision making with students without abdicating responsibility because they're the adult in the relationship. I know we could talk about that, we could make a whole seminar around this issue, but we'd better move on.
So we better make one for you, Jill.
Yeah.
Okay, some of the things we thought in the whole youth area, which is so much a government focus at the moment, we think there needs to be a lot more thinking and talking about the whole notion of 21st learning and what that means in terms of being literate and what that means in being in terms of literate for young people, young adults. There's a growing body of research about using ICTs and mobile technologies and acknowledging young people's facility with those. And that's a whole conversation and research waiting to be had, I think. This came out strongly in the OECD report about New Zealand and youth employment, but that I don't want to use that word underbody or underbelly or
long tail.
That a big group of young people who really are at risk educationally, socially, and how to reach them. We mused quite a bit about teacher quality. I've referred to that before. Maybe there needs to be a comprehensive strategy about that. The government's certainly funding little bits and pieces of it. And perhaps another look at the funding for all these diverse pieces of youth engagement and literacy and numeracy. I think the other strong finding is that whilst we have multiple approaches, which can be slightly confusing at times, it seems we should stick with a variety of ways because different young people are engaged in different activities and very engaged.
Okay, I'm just going to change tack for a minute, and this won't be relevant for everybody, but for people who are working with Youth Guarantee, with young people who don't yet have their Level 1 NZQA, this is just a bit of a heads up on the fact that the way that literacy and numeracy is determined in the Level 1 NZQA is being worked on and is changing. This is a screenshot here from NZQA's website, and you'll be able to go back and look at the detail of it later. You'll see it's under the NQF button at the top. And what's there, but not quite on the screen because I didn't get the whole screen in, are some PDFs of the new unit standards that are going to be used to determine literacy and numeracy. There are 3 for each, and they follow the progressions. So there's one on reading, one on speaking, one on writing, and in the numeracy ones there's one on measurement, one on statistics, and one on number. And the approach that's being used is an approach of embedding. So when you look at those, they talk about naturally occurring evidence, and perhaps we'll just look at the next shot there. Did that change? I right-clicked because of the side I'm sitting on. Whoops. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So they're about embedding, and those 3 standards for literacy and 3 standards for numeracy add up to a required 10 credits. Students are expected to get all of those 10 credits, but they're expected to do that work when they're working on their other unit standards so that it's naturally occurring evidence. The other pathway over there, the achievement standards pathway, is possibly not so relevant to the Youth Guarantee course, but that way there is for naturally occurring evidence and other achievement standards. And it's my understanding that the Ministry of Education is compiling a list of the achievement standards which will generate evidence for each of those areas of literacy and numeracy. So if that's relevant for the young people that you're working with, my recommendation is to go to NZQA's website, have a look at this suite of draft unit standards and provide some feedback to NZQA.
Should we go back to that?
I think people can go back and look at it for themselves.
I found it really hard to
well,
find.
NZQA's website, I have to say, isn't the easiest to navigate. But Jen, actually, if people can see the cursor being moved on the screen, there you are up the top there, that one that says NQF, that's the one to go into, and then from there you can find the development and review of the unit standards, and it's under there. And actually, if I could scroll down, which I can't because this is a passive grab, you'll be able to see all the PDFs of the new standards there. Yes, if you look on the right hand side, Rob's just typed the URL to go into, and it's on the bottom of the screen there too, actually. So that's probably enough to say about that. It's just, yes, just click through the next two, Jen. And it's the same for numeracy, that's all that says. Just a bit of a heads up on that change that's coming. Next year is a transition year, and the year after, this is the arrangement that will pertain. That's enough about that, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you'd been in Christchurch or Wellington, it would have been lunchtime now.
Took about a gallop through.
And then in the afternoon, we did a donut exercise where we'd asked people to bring their favourite resource or a resource that worked really well with young people in literacy and numeracy. And we were really impressed.
Some marvellous ideas.
Really great ideas. I think a lot of them may have come through people studying the National Certificate, and we were really impressed with Haito and the hairdressers, who were right on board and had some very exciting resources for numeracy in particular. Yes,
their embedding resources were brilliant, we thought.
Yeah. So there were lots of interesting variations on cards and matching, bingo, telling the time, lots of kind of ways to teach that.
Lots of cards showing different ways to represent proportions and to practice decimal place and things like that.
Which we found with the assessment tool are the pieces of numeracy that all the adult population struggles with most. Can you remember?
Well, I got put on the spot in Christchurch because we were one person short, and I had to join the donut without having a chance to bring some resources and think about it. And the suggestion I made, which people found very interesting and useful, was to use the search function on Google Images to pick different images of the same idea and to use those to have a conversation with students about the constructedness of diagrams and communication, because there's never just one way to show things, and it's been my experience that students with low literacy skills can be greatly empowered by understanding that and not thinking that if something isn't transparently clear to them, it's their fault and there's something wrong with them, rather than the fact that there is no perfect way to communicate ideas and visually and so on. So some sort of which image is best to show, which diagram is best to show, that sort of activity. People thought that was a good idea, Jen.
Great. We had a variety of people at the workshops. Hello, David. David has joined the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome. So a lot of them were in student support services, some were program managers and some were vocational tutors, and some were literacy and numeracy specialists. So a lot of the discussion about issues of management and pastoral care revolved around utilising people in different roles, and having a sort of a collaborative approach to providing that one-on-one support for young people.
And a lot of them were strategies that involved students in making self-assessments about their own learning and building their confidence to think that they could do that rather than just having a judgment visited on top of them. Which I guess is an aspect of the student voice that we were talking about before.
So some of the online resources, which I presume you'll be familiar with, but definitely not everybody was, depending on their role. The literacy portal, which is managed by Workbase for the TEC, has fantastic resources, as does Literacy Aotearoa. I didn't write that up there. And Literacy and Numeracy for Adults.com has a whole resource pool. And if you just Google skills workshop or skills wise, there's a huge range of resources offered by the UK that you can access through that. Skills workshop is produced by teachers, and it's very easy to find things using a search engine, so like vocabulary at step 1 or those kinds of things. And the skills wise are interactive, kind of like teach yourself ideas that is hosted by the BBC, but we will put these in the report that we'll send out to you. What happened there?
There we go.
Okay, so just to finish off this part of the session, the assessment tool, there was a huge range of, people's knowledge about the tool. This screenshot just shows where you'll go to get initial information and how to sign up. So if you personally are an educator and are interested in finding more about the assessment tool, you should go to the person in your organisation who's the administrator. The organisation needs to sign up with an ESA login. This is probably the next, I'll just go back down to the next slide. I should have put this one here. So that's the ESA, that's managed by the Ministry of Education. And but how to get into it is accessed from here. So you apply to the Ministry of Education, and then when that has been approved, it comes to the NZQA support team, who will hook you in to the assessment tool.
There's a dedicated team to do that, so you should be able to get help very quickly.
Yes, yeah, it is great, Jill, and I'm not sure how many organisations are signed up now, but well over 100, and that's probably quite out of date. So if you're an Jill's saying now that's great. So if you're an educator, an organisation administrator, you're given a password, a sign up from ESA, like mine is, what's mine? Jenny. Whatman J1. Yes, just fairly straightforward. And then I've made myself a password, so that if as an educator or an organisational administrator, I get into the something that,
I don't have one.
don't you?
No, I feel deprived.
So this is what you'd be looking for as an educator. You'd probably go into the assessments folder, and it's not very clear on my screen, and I'm sorry about that, but you would be looking at the assessments that already exist, and you can filter them by literacy, numeracy, or writing, or by date, and there's or by type, whether it's adaptive or non-adaptive, and so on. This is this one, right? So this is what I'm trying to show here is the increasing specificity that you get by going into the wider website. So this is a list of assessments that we've made up for demonstrating, and if I click on report, this is what would come up for my particular group's report. All right, so I can see there, looking at that in this reading assessment that I set my group, that most of my class are achieving at step 1 and a minority at step 2 and step
That's on the literacy,
3.
that's on the adult literacy progressions. This tool is calibrated to those.
Oh, that's a good point. I think I assumed that people knew that.
Well, we probably better say it.
So we better go backwards. So let me know if I've gone too fast and made too many assumptions. It did seem to us that most people were aware of the tool, although some of them hadn't actually been in and seen how easy it was
to use.
To actually use.
Yes, it's a shame that we can't show you its interactivity, but we'd need to be live on the web to do that.
Yeah. So, so as an educator, I set an assessment, which was Introduction to Carpentry Assessment 1. I looked at the report of all my learners that was generated, and then if I wanted to see what was happening for an individual, I'd click on the little graph icon there. So in this case it's for Alexander, or J. Alexander. And this is what it would show me.
It's impossible to read.
No, it's impossible for me to read. You might be able to.
Full screen.
They can, or I can.
Yeah, they
You
can as
can.
well. So if you click on
Yeah. We were having trouble seeing the screen because it's quite a busy screen.
Oh.
There's a lot on it, and now it's taking a minute to load up. So, yeah.
Oh.
Here it comes.
It's bigger. It's still okay. It's just.
Yeah. It's helping a wee bit.
100%. Should I click that? That one.
The magnifying glass.
We're zooming.
Yeah.
All right. So this is one piece from Jay's assessment. It relates to one of the questions that he took. So if I was, are you there? Are you right?
I was just going to say, if you want to see the chat again, you could click to the bottom. Sorry.
All right. We're just finding the chat again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Sorry. Is that right?
Exit full screen.
Yeah.
Yep. So click on
Exit.
that. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, we're back again now. Okay, so we can see how he's actually scored on the individual question. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then if it tells you sort of the metadata about it, or the background data about it. But then we can click again, and one more and I haven't done a very good job of grabbing this screenshot, but I'm pretty sure that you can scroll across and you'll see on the left-hand side, this was the piece of information he had to read, and then on the right-hand side, if you scroll across, you'll see what his answer was. So we could have started by looking at the individual questions and then going up. Or I've chosen to start sort of generally with the bigger report and then go down to the detail of level of individual questions. We hadn't expected to spend very much time on the assessment tool, mostly because the Tertiary Education Commission's offering workshops throughout New Zealand, and so we just wanted to talk a little bit about the teaching and learning functions rather than the sort of technology and how to get into the tool.
Yes, I think an important thing to realise about that when you're using it is that there's such a specific level of feedback about individual students that it can support a really rich learning conversation with them. It's not just for making judgments about where they've got up to, but actually seeing what you need to do next to support and help them.
Mm-hmm. So there are well over 2,000 different questions for literacy, for reading and numeracy in the tool, and each one of them has been trialled at least 150 times by you and your learners. Thank you very much. And then they've all been calibrated and their item difficulty determined against every other question in the assessment.
You haven't got have you got a shot in there, Jen, that shows the scale?
I haven't.
You haven't? No. When you have a look at it and you look at the scale, the little corrows for the levels of progression all sit on the side. And one of the things that people noticed, and that is particularly interesting about that, is that they're not evenly spaced. There's quite a big jump from the level 1 corrow on the progression to the level 2 one. And it's important for people to have that information because students can be making progress within level 1 and yet not yet have got to level 2. Now previously you might have thought that they weren't making progress. Now you can actually see that they are because you can see how much further up the scale they're moving even if they haven't got to level 2 yet. So, and the other thing that I like about it, and Jenny's been involved in making it, so for me it was new when I saw it at the first seminar. I like its interactivity in the way that it adjusts. So if a learner starts and they're getting the items wrong, it starts giving them easier items so that they can experience some success, and if they're getting them all too easily, it starts giving them more difficult items. And so you can get an accurate fix on where somebody is, because if you give someone a test that they get all wrong, then you know nothing other than that they got it all wrong. So by adjusting to the level which is the appropriate level for the learner, it gives much more specific information. I think that's clever use of interactivity. I love it. Yeah.
Oh, the last other thing about that is that it's been set up so there's a training environment. So if people are a bit nervous, as I tend to be about playing around with the technology, you can do it in a whole area that doesn't save anything. So you can make assessments and make believe learners and give them assessments and read their reports, and none of it will interfere with
the real thing.
Okay.
It's almost 11.
I think we're done, and yeah, thank you for your responses, Jill. And I think we might sign off, shall we?
So
They
that
shuffle their papers.
we could be like the two Ronnies and say, it's goodbye from Hannah. How did they do that? It's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from him
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
her.
but they did it in a way that was contradictory. The whole idea of jokes is you're supposed to get them right, isn't it?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Should we copy the text?
Oh, I just